Through the cold and darkness, muffled sounds reached me as if filtered through water. My limbs felt like lead, sluggish and unresponsive. The sharp smell of disinfectant burned my nostrils, and when I finally opened my eyes, the blinding white light above me sent a shock of pain to the back of my skull. It took a moment for reality to sink in. I was lying on a steel table, a sheet pulled over my body. Panic surged through me. I jerked upward, the sudden movement tearing the sheet from my chest. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I looked around, taking in the sterile walls and the cold metallic gleam of the room. The air was heavy with the weight of silence, broken only by the distant hum of machinery. It hit me like a freight train. This is the morgue. I stumbled off the table, my bare feet landing on the icy tile floor. My legs wobbled as though they belonged to someone else. My fingers found the edges of the table for support, gripping so hard my knuckles turned white. The last thing I remembered was darkness. No, wait, there was more. A face. April's face. A man beside her. And a fight. I pressed my hand to my temple, trying to steady the whirl of fragmented images in my head. April, my wife. Her radiant smile, once my beacon, now etched with shadows. Her laughter, which used to echo in my chest like a melody, had grown hollow. Then there was the man. His features were blurred in my memory, but his presence felt like poison in my veins. What happened? My voice came out hoarse, rasping against the silence. My words dissipated into the emptiness, unanswered. A sound, a sharp intake of breath, made me whip around. A young man in a white coat stood frozen in the doorway, a clipboard clutched to his chest. His eyes were wide, his face drained of color. Why you're... he stammered, stepping backward. I'm not dead, I said, though it felt more like a question than a statement. My voice cracked, and I swallowed hard, trying to force coherence into the chaos inside me. What happened to me? The man didn't move. I took a step toward him, and he flinched, his back hitting the doorframe. They said you were gone. No pulse. No breathing. You've been here for hours. Hours. My brain latched onto the word like a lifeline. Hours. Not days. Not weeks. I was still alive. My fingers instinctively went to my throat, searching for a pulse. It thudded faintly under my fingertips, slow but steady. Relief crashed over me, followed quickly by a chilling realization. How did I get here? My words sharpened, cutting through the air. The man's voice trembled. I don't know. The paramedics brought you in. They said it was an accident. Severe head trauma. They tried resuscitation, but... His voice trailed off, his eyes darting to the table I'd just vacated. They declared you dead. My legs nearly gave out beneath me, but I caught myself on the table. The fragments in my mind started to piece together. April's face, her eyes cold and distant. The man beside her, his smug grin. And the fight. A searing pain in the back of my head, the sensation of falling, and then nothing. They tried to kill me, I whispered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. April and the man, her lover. They had orchestrated this. They had left me for dead. The young man's brow furrowed, confusion crossing his face. What are you talking about? Who tried to? I didn't let him finish. I pushed past him, my bare feet slapping against the tile floor. My body screamed in protest, every step sending jolts of pain up my legs, but I didn't stop. I needed to get out. I needed to think. And most of all, I needed answers. The hallway outside was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights flickering ominously. I stumbled through it, my shadow trailing me like a ghost. I found a mirror in a supply room, and when I saw my reflection, I recoiled. My face was a mosaic of bruises and cuts, my features swollen and discolored. I barely recognized myself. Maybe that's for the best, I thought bitterly. The man I used to be, April's husband, the trusting fool, was dead. They'd killed him. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't gone. Not entirely. Something cold and unyielding hardened in my chest. A resolve I didn't know I possessed. If they thought they could erase me, they were wrong. If they thought I'd disappear quietly, they didn't know me at all. I stepped back from the mirror, my reflection glaring back at me with a fire that hadn't been there before. The man staring back wasn't a victim. He was a shadow, risen from the grave, and shadows have a way of haunting those who cast them. Waking up in the morgue was a miracle, or a curse. I wasn't sure which. The man I had been was gone, and in his place stood a hollowed-out version of someone I barely recognized. My body was a canvas of pain, my face a road map of scars, but the wounds that ran deepest couldn't be seen. They throbbed in my chest, in the empty space where my trust in April used to live. After leaving the morgue, I moved through the streets of New Orleans like a ghost, unnoticed and unrecognizable. I had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. April had been my anchor, the one I built my life around. And now she had destroyed it. I found refuge in a small, grimy motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions and no one cares about the answers. My reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror confirmed what I already knew. The man staring back at me wasn't the same one who'd kissed April goodbye that morning. My face was swollen and bruised, with jagged cuts that had crusted over in uneven lines. My right cheekbone had caved slightly inward, and my lips were split and crooked. "You're dead," I whispered to the man in the mirror. "And that's the only reason you're alive." The first step was survival. I stayed hidden, moving only at night, scrounging for food and nursing my wounds as best I could. News of my death had traveled quickly. I saw my name in the obituaries the first time I ventured out to buy a paper. "William Bill Carter, beloved husband, tragically killed in an accident." There was no mention of foul play, no hint of suspicion. They had done a good job covering their tracks. The second step was reinvention. My old life was gone, and with it my identity. I needed to become someone new, someone invisible. Using an old contact from my college days, a fixer who specialized in solving problems for a price, I managed to secure a fake ID, a burner phone, and a new name, Jack Monroe. "Rough life?" the fixer asked, sliding the documents across the table. His eyes lingered on my face, taking in the damage. "Something like that," I replied, my voice hoarse. "Well, Jack," he said with a wry grin, "welcome to the shadows. Just don't do anything stupid." The third step was reconstruction. I used what little savings I had stashed in an old account, one April didn't know about, to pay for plastic surgery. It wasn't vanity, it was necessity. My scars were a liability. They would draw attention, and attention was the last thing I needed. The surgeon was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a no-questions-asked policy. "This will hurt," he warned me before the first incision. He wasn't lying. The days that followed were a blur of painkillers, bandages, and sleepless nights. When the bandages finally came off, I stared into the mirror and saw a stranger. My features were sharper, harder, the face of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Weeks turned into months as I healed, physically and mentally. The motel room became my sanctuary, its peeling wallpaper and flickering light bulb a constant reminder of how far I'd fallen. But it also became my war room. On the cracked desk, I laid out everything I knew. April's increasingly distant behavior. The night of the attack. The man who'd been with her. I needed a plan. Confronting April outright would be foolish. She'd already proven she was willing to kill me once, and I had no doubt she'd try again if she thought I posed a threat. No, this had to be done carefully, methodically. One night, as I sat in the dim glow of the desk lamp, I thought about April. The way her laughter used to light up a room. The way her touch used to make me feel invincible. How had we gotten here? How had I become the man she could plot to kill without a second thought? "She was never who you thought she was," I muttered to myself. "You just didn't want to see it." The truth was as bitter as the cheap whiskey I'd been nursing for days. I had been a fool, blinded by love and too trusting to see the cracks in our foundation. April's betrayal had shattered me, but it had also awakened something I didn't know I had, a burning desire for justice, or maybe revenge. I began tracking her movements. The burner phone became my lifeline, a tool to collect information without leaving a trace. I watched April from the shadows, her world carrying on as if I had never existed. She smiled, she laughed, she held hands with him, the man who had helped her bury me. Their life was picture perfect, but I could see the cracks. They were careful, but not careful enough. I noticed the way she glanced over her shoulder when they were out in public, the way she hesitated before unlocking the door to our old house. She wasn't haunted by guilt, she was haunted by fear. Somewhere deep down, she knew the truth: I wasn't gone. Not entirely. The first sign I gave her was subtle. An old photograph of us, one she thought she'd lost, appeared in her mailbox. It was from our honeymoon, the two of us smiling on a sunlit beach. I wrote a single word on the back: remember. The second sign was more direct. Her wedding ring, the one she'd claimed had been stolen, reappeared on her bedside table. The third was a note, slipped under her door: you can't bury the truth. By the time I left the motel for good, April was already unraveling. Her smile seemed forced, her laughter hollow. She couldn't sleep. I could see the bags under her eyes even from a distance. But this was just the beginning. I hadn't come back to scare her. I had come back to destroy her. I stepped into the humid New Orleans night, leaving the crumbling walls of the motel behind. The city had always been alive, pulsing with the heartbeat of jazz, the clinking of glasses, and the murmur of 1,000 stories unfolding in shadowed corners. Tonight, it felt different, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to make my move. My new face didn't just hide me, it liberated me. The scars were gone, replaced by features sharper, harder, more unfamiliar. A stranger stared back at me every time I caught my reflection. But beneath this mask of reconstructed skin, I was still the same man, at least, the parts of me April hadn't destroyed. I carried her betrayal like a phantom weight, each memory sharpening my resolve. The first person I needed to see was Maria. She lived 2 blocks away from the house I used to share with April, her window overlooking the street where we parked our car. Maria was a classic New Orleans busybody, always watering her plants on the porch, always knowing too much. If anyone had seen something the night of the attack, it would be her. When I knocked on her door, it took a moment for her to answer. "Yes?" she called, her voice tinged with suspicion. A chain rattled, and the door cracked open. "Hi, Maria," I said, leaning slightly to catch her eye. "I'm a friend of the Carters. Bill and April. I was wondering if you could help me with something." Her eyes narrowed as she took me in, her wrinkled hands gripping the doorframe. "Friend, huh? Haven't seen you before. I'm from out of town," I lied smoothly. "Just got here. I wanted to ask about that night, when Bill died." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she crossed her arms. "Terrible thing. Poor April. What about it?" "I heard it was sudden," I said, keeping my tone light. "I was just wondering if you saw anything unusual that night. Something that didn't sit right." Maria hesitated. Her fingers fidgeted with the chain of her necklace, a habit I remembered from countless interactions. She always fiddled when she had something to say but didn't want to say it. "Well," she began slowly, "I didn't see anything, but I heard voices. Loud ones. And then a car sped off real fast. That wasn't like Bill. He was a gentleman. Quiet. Respectful." My chest tightened at her words. "Did you recognize the voices?" She shook her head, but her eyes flickered. "No, but I did see April later. She came back alone, walking. It was strange, you know." She looked upset. Distraught. Maria's account was small, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew: April wasn't the grieving widow she pretended to be. She had returned to the scene to cover her tracks, leaving me for dead without so much as a backward glance. I thanked Maria and walked away, my mind racing. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but I still needed more. The man, her lover, my would-be murderer, remained a shadow in the corner of my memory, his face blurred, his voice indistinct. He was the key, and I was determined to find him. The next step in my plan was the cafe where April had started spending her evenings. It was a quaint little place, tucked away in a corner of the French Quarter, with outdoor seating and fairy lights strung along the railings. I'd followed her there once, keeping my distance, watching as she laughed with a man whose back was turned to me. Even from afar, their connection was palpable. She leaned in too close. He touched her hand too casually. They were lovers. It was obvious. I chose a table in the corner, hidden by the shadows cast by the overhead lights. April wasn't there yet, but I wasn't waiting for her. I was here to learn more about the man who had replaced me in her life. The staff was friendly, eager to share gossip. "That guy?" one of the waiters said when I asked about April's companion. "Yeah, he comes here a lot. Big tipper. I think his name's Derek or something like that." Derek. The name lodged itself in my mind like a thorn. I asked more questions, keeping my tone casual, and learned that Derek was well known around the neighborhood. He was a businessman, wealthy, charming, a man who seemed to have everything. And yet, he'd chosen to destroy my life to be with April. By the time April arrived at the cafe, I was gone, but my presence lingered. I'd left a photograph folded neatly on her table, a picture of us from our first anniversary, laughing in front of the St. Louis Cathedral. Written on the back in bold letters was a single word: forever. From my vantage point across the street, I watched her reaction. She froze when she saw the photograph, her face draining of color. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the crowd as if expecting to see me. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead, she slipped the photo into her purse and sat down as if nothing had happened. Derek joined her minutes later, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. He kissed her cheek, and they began talking, their voices low and intimate. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. The tension in her body spoke volumes. She was scared. Good. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I felt a flicker of satisfaction for the first time in months. April had started this game, but I was going to finish it. The mask I wore wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental. I had become someone new, someone capable of unraveling the web of lies she had spun around me. As I poured myself a drink and stared at the city lights outside my window, a thought crept into my mind, sharp and undeniable. She doesn't know it yet, but I've already won. The next morning, I stood on the balcony of my cramped apartment, watching the sun climb over the New Orleans skyline. The air was thick, clinging to my skin like a reminder of everything I couldn't escape. Below, the city buzzed with life, trolley cars rattling, street vendors calling out their wares, and the faint strains of jazz drifting up from the quarter. But none of it touched me. I was a ghost, moving unseen through the cracks of a life I no longer belonged to. April thought she had erased me. She thought I was buried, my memory fading into nothingness. But I was still here, and I wasn't just a shadow. I was a reminder of the life she tried to destroy, and I was about to haunt her in ways she couldn't imagine. The photograph had done its job. April was rattled. I'd watched her that night at the cafe, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, her laughter forced. Derek didn't notice, too busy charming the waitress and spinning tales of his latest business ventures. He didn't know me. But I knew him now. That night, I scrawled a message on a slip of paper. The words came easily, dredged up from the depths of our shared history. "Do you still keep roses on the nightstand?" It was a phrase I'd once said to her as a joke, back when we were still in love and she insisted on fresh flowers every week. I slipped the note into an envelope and mailed it to her address. 2 days later, I saw the effect. April emerged from our old house, her face pale, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her keys. I stayed hidden in the shadows, watching as she scanned the street, her movements frantic. She thought she was imagining things, that her mind was playing tricks on her. That was the power of memory. It could be more terrifying than any ghost. But I wasn't done yet. I started leaving objects in places she would find them. A book of poetry she'd once loved appeared on the coffee table. Inside, I circled the verse that reminded her of our first trip to the bayou. I placed our old wedding invitation in her mailbox, the ink slightly smudged from age. Each item was a breadcrumb, a piece of our past that I knew she couldn't ignore. The best was the bracelet. It was a simple gold chain, something I'd given her on our 3rd anniversary. She'd lost it years ago, or at least, that's what she told me. I left it on her bathroom counter, next to her toothbrush. When I saw her leave the house that morning, her hand trembled as she touched her wrist, as if confirming the bracelet wasn't still there. The following evening, I watched from across the street as Derek arrived. He kissed her on the doorstep, his arms wrapping around her possessively. They disappeared inside, and I imagined her showing him the objects, trying to explain them away. "Bill's dead," she would say. "It's impossible." But her voice would shake. Doubt would creep in. And doubt was all I needed. That night I wrote the next note. "You can't bury the past, April. It always rises." I left it on her windshield, tucked under the wiper. This time, she didn't just glance at it. She froze, her eyes locked on the words. Her breathing quickened, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But she didn't. She ripped the note in half, threw it on the ground, and drove off with a squeal of tires. I followed her. April's car weaved through the French Quarter, then turned into the lot of a small bar on the edge of the Garden District. It was one of those dimly lit places where you went to drown your sorrows or hide your sins. I parked a block away and watched as she walked in. Derek wasn't with her. She was alone, her shoulders hunched as though the weight of her secrets had finally started pressing down on her. Inside, she ordered a drink and sat at the far end of the bar. Her fingers tapped nervously against the glass, her eyes darting to the door every time it opened. She was waiting for someone, but not Derek. She was waiting for me. I didn't go inside. Not yet. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. Instead, I watched from the shadows, letting the tension simmer. The next day, I raised the stakes. I left a small box on her front porch, tied with a ribbon. Inside was a single rose and a note. "You told me roses made you feel alive. Do they still?" The effect was immediate. April didn't even touch the box. She stared at it for a long moment, then called Derek. I could see them through the window arguing. He was dismissive, waving his hands as though she was being ridiculous. But April wasn't buying it. Her paranoia had taken root, and it was growing fast. By the end of the week, I had her exactly where I wanted her, scared, uncertain, and questioning everything. Derek was beginning to lose patience, his charm fading under the weight of her spiraling fear. I watched as their perfect facade began to crack. April was unraveling, her once flawless composure replaced with frantic glances and sleepless nights. She paced the house at odd hours, double-checking locks and closing curtains. She was living in a prison of her own making, and I was the warden. That night, I left one final note. "Do you still dream of me, April? Because I've been dreaming of you." This time, I didn't stay to watch her reaction. I didn't need to. The walls were closing in, and she was running out of places to hide. April's world was unraveling, and I was the one pulling the threads. It wasn't just the notes, or the objects anymore. It was the silence that followed, the void of explanations, the absence of anything tangible she could cling to. I was in her head now, a shadow lurking in the corners of her mind, whispering reminders of the life she thought she'd buried. I watched her house that evening from the darkened cab of my car, parked a few doors down. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down like a heavy hand. Through the sheer curtains, I saw April pacing, her phone in her hand. She called someone, Derek, I guessed. Moments later, she hung up, her expression tight with frustration. She grabbed a glass of wine and sat on the couch, her legs curled beneath her like she was trying to make herself smaller. By now, the cracks between her and Derek were showing. Their perfect little affair was beginning to sour under the weight of her paranoia. He didn't believe her, of course. Why would he? To him, I was nothing more than a corpse, a name scratched into a death certificate. He had nothing to fear. But April knew better. Deep down, she felt me there, even if she couldn't explain how. The objects I left behind weren't just memories, they were anchors. The poetry book, the photograph, the bracelet, each one was a tether, pulling her back to the life she thought she'd escaped. They weren't random, they were deliberate, chosen for the way they would sting. The notes were worse. Words have a way of burrowing into your soul, of taking root and festering. The ones I left weren't just reminders, they were accusations, each one a mirror reflecting her guilt. The next day, I left her something new, an old record. It was a jazz album we used to play on lazy Sunday mornings, the sound of the saxophone filling the house while we sipped coffee and read the paper. I left it on her front porch with a note tucked inside the sleeve. "Still your favorite song?" She found it just before noon. I watched from a safe distance as she picked it up, her hands trembling. She turned the note over, reading it again and again as if trying to decipher a hidden message. Her eyes darted up and down the street, searching for someone, anyone, who might have left it. But there was no one there. Just me, watching from the shadows. When Derek arrived that evening, the record was gone, but I knew it had done its work. Through the window, I saw her show him the note. He laughed, an easy, dismissive laugh that made her shoulders tense. They argued again. She threw the note at him and stormed into the kitchen. Derek followed her, his voice raised now, his frustration spilling over. He grabbed her arm, but she shook him off, shouting something I couldn't hear. He slammed the door on his way out, leaving her alone in the house. The next few days, I pushed harder. I left more notes, each one more personal than the last. "You never told me why you stopped wearing that blue dress. Do you still hear my voice in the quiet moments? You didn't just kill me, April. You killed us." The final note I left that week was the simplest. "I'm waiting." That evening, April cracked. I saw it in the way she clutched her phone, pacing the living room with frantic energy. She called Derek, but this time, he didn't come. She called someone else, a friend maybe. Her voice was high-pitched and trembling, her words spilling out too quickly. Then she did something unexpected. She left the house. I followed her through the winding streets of the French Quarter, keeping a safe distance. She drove to a small, tucked-away boutique hotel, the kind of place people go to disappear. I watched as she parked and hurried inside. She wasn't meeting Derek. She wasn't meeting anyone. She was running. I waited for hours, watching the lights in her room flicker on and off. She called someone again. Her voice echoed faintly through the open window. From the snippets I could hear, she was pleading. The next day, I left her one last item. It was a framed picture of us, one that had once hung in our bedroom. The image was of a happier time, me in my old college sweatshirt, her in that blue dress she used to love. I'd taken it down when things started falling apart, but I'd never gotten rid of it. Now it was back, a reminder of what we had been, and what she'd destroyed. I placed it on the doorstep of the hotel, wrapped in brown paper. Inside I slipped another note. "Do you remember when we were this happy?" That night, I watched from a cafe across the street as she unwrapped the package in her room. Her reaction was immediate. She sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands clutching the frame like it was a lifeline. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't cry out. She didn't make a sound. Her silence was louder than any scream. April was breaking, piece by piece. Her guilt was consuming her, and I was feeding it, one memory at a time. Derek was losing patience, and the cracks in their relationship were widening. She was slipping away from him, consumed by a past she couldn't escape. And I was just getting started. The air in New Orleans felt heavier that week, like the city itself was in mourning. April's world was unraveling, and I had become its architect. The reminders of our past, the subtle whispers of what she'd done, had worked their way into her mind like ivy through cracks in stone. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The notes were my most effective weapon. Words, after all, have a power all their own. They can cut deeper than a blade, linger longer than a scar. And mine were surgical strikes, each one designed to burrow into her soul and twist the knife of guilt. That morning, I left another note. It was taped to her rearview mirror, the words written in the same bold, deliberate hand. I see you. I didn't stay to watch her find it. I didn't need to. I already knew how she'd react. The fear would flash across her face, followed by the frantic glance over her shoulder, the searching of shadows that held no answers. She would tell herself it wasn't possible, that I was gone. But doubt would creep in, and with doubt came terror. April didn't go to work that day. I watched as she left the house, her movements hurried, her face pale. She drove aimlessly through the city, her hands gripping the wheel as if she were trying to outrun the truth. But there was no escape, not from me. I followed her to a park, where she sat on a bench near the fountain. She stared at the water, her shoulders hunched, her fingers twisting the strap of her purse. For a moment, she looked small, fragile, like the April I'd once loved. It almost made me hesitate. Almost. Later that evening, I left another note, this one folded neatly and slipped under her pillow. It read, "Did you ever love me, or was it always a lie?" I could imagine the moment she found it. The sharp intake of breath, the way her fingers would tremble as she unfolded the paper. She would hear my voice in those words, the pain and betrayal. And she would know it was me. But the game wasn't just about April anymore. Derek was beginning to feel the ripples. He'd always seemed so confident, so sure of himself, but now cracks were forming in his polished veneer. I'd been careful to observe him, to learn his patterns. He was a creature of habit, breakfast at the same cafe, meetings at the same office downtown, evenings spent with April. His world was predictable, rigid, easy to disrupt. The first note I left for Derek was simple. "She's lying to you." I taped it to the windshield of his car, ensuring it was the first thing he'd see when he left his office. I didn't stay to watch his reaction, but I imagined the confusion, the flicker of doubt. He would confront April, of course. He would demand answers. And she would have none. Their arguments became louder, more frequent. I heard them through the thin walls of the house as I watched from the street. Derek's voice was sharp, accusatory, while April's was desperate, pleading. She was losing him, and she knew it. One night, I decided to escalate. I left a note in Derek's jacket pocket during one of his evening outings. It read, "Do you know what she did to him?" This time, I stayed to watch. When he found the note, his expression shifted, confusion, then anger. He crumpled it in his fist and looked around, his eyes scanning the bar for whoever might have slipped it into his pocket. But I was already gone, blending into the crowd like a shadow. The following morning, Derek confronted April on the front porch. Their voices carried across the quiet street, raw and biting. "Who's doing this?" he demanded, holding up the crumpled note. "Is it someone you know? Someone from your past?" April shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know. I don't know anything anymore." "You're lying," he snapped, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "What aren't you telling me, April?" She collapsed onto the porch steps, her face buried in her hands. "It's him," she whispered. "It has to be him." "Who?" Derek pressed, his tone harsh. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and haunted. "Bill." Derek froze, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief. "Bill's dead, April. You told me." "I know what I told you," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "But these notes, these things, who else could it be?" That night, I left one final note for April, placed carefully in the mailbox where I knew she'd find it. It read, "I never left." When April opened the mailbox the next morning, she screamed. The sound echoed down the street, sharp and primal. She held the note in her hands, her entire body shaking. Derek rushed out of the house, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What is it now?" he demanded. She shoved the note at him, her eyes wild. "I can't do this anymore, Derek. I can't." "Get a grip, April," he snapped, though his own voice trembled slightly. "You're losing it." But I knew she wasn't losing it. She was finally seeing the truth. I was still here, and I wasn't going anywhere. The bayou at night was a place where the past came alive. Shadows danced between the trees, the air hung thick with the scent of decay, and the hum of insects created a symphony that set my nerves on edge. This was where April and Derek had left me to die, and tonight, it would serve as the stage for their reckoning. 2 messages, carefully planned. To April. I know what you did. Come to the bayou. Midnight. To Derek. You can't hide forever. Meet me at the bayou. Midnight. Neither knew the other would be there. Their guilt would ensure they came. Derek was the first to arrive. His car rolled up to the clearing, its headlights cutting through the gloom before shutting off. He stepped out with a flashlight, the beam trembling as it swept across the ground. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. Who's here? He called, his voice sharp but strained. Moments later, April's car arrived. She stepped out slowly, her movements hesitant, her eyes darting nervously through the darkness. When she saw Derek, her confusion was immediate. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice rising. I could ask you the same thing. Derek snapped. I got a message. Someone said to come here. What's going on? April shook her head, crossing her arms defensively. I don't know. I got a message too. This doesn't make any sense. That would be me, I said, stepping out from the shadows. The beam of Derek's flashlight landed on me, and I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. April froze, her face pale, her hands trembling as she stared at me. Bill, she whispered, her voice shaking. No. This isn't possible. You're dead. That's what you wanted, wasn't it? I said, my voice cold and steady. You left me here to die, thinking the swamp would take care of the rest. But you failed. April staggered back, clutching the car door for support. I don't understand, she stammered. How are you here? Because you didn't finish the job, I said, stepping closer. But tonight you're going to face what you did. Derek's posture stiffened, though I could see the unease in his eyes. This is some kind of trick, he said, his voice faltering. Bill's dead. Whoever you are, you've got the wrong people. I laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the stillness. A trick? Is that what you told yourself the night you stood over me, making sure I wasn't breathing? Derek's flashlight wavered in his grip, his silence betraying him. I remember it all, I said, my tone sharp. April brought me here, acting like it was some romantic surprise. And then you appeared. You didn't hesitate. You hit me from behind, didn't you? You thought one blow would be enough. April broke down, her sobs filling the clearing as she sank to the ground. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she cried. I didn't want. You didn't want what? I snapped, my gaze burning into her. Didn't want me to wake up? Didn't want to be reminded of what you did? Derek exhaled sharply, his flashlight dropping to his side. I hid you, he muttered, his voice low and strained. I thought it was over. April let out a strangled sob, her face buried in her hands. I didn't know what else to do, she whimpered. You wouldn't let me go, Bill. I couldn't take it anymore. You couldn't take it? I said, incredulous. So you decided to kill me? To leave me bleeding in the mud like some animal? April didn't answer, her body racked with sobs. Derek stood still, his fists clenched, his face twisted with guilt. The first raindrops began to fall, pattering against the leaves as the storm finally broke. I stepped closer, my voice rising over the sound of the rain. You killed me, I said, my tone cutting through the chaos. You left me here to die, thinking I'd disappear and you'd be free. But I survived. And now you'll spend the rest of your lives remembering what you did. Derek turned away, his movements slow and heavy, and began walking toward his car. April stayed where she was, crumpled on the ground, her sobs lost in the roar of the rain. I stood over her, my voice cold and final. You took everything from me, April. And now you'll live with the truth. Without another word, I turned and walked away, the rain washing over me as I disappeared into the darkness. Behind me, their lives lay in ruins, shattered by the weight of their own guilt.